Chapter 4. On the top right of the 38-inch curved screen, a face flashed up. Bing, bing. Stella would have been annoyed, but it was Violet. Stella always answered for Violet. Stella pulled off her glasses and picked up her long, cold oolong tea, wondering how much time had passed since she sat down to review the algorithm test results. She clicked the answer button. "Hello, Violet," Stella said. "Oh," came Violet's surprised voice. Her round, bright face and long, stick-straight brown hair filled the screen. Olga Violet Vasiliev never expected people to answer her calls. "Are we connecting out to the language model, or do you want to choose from the static list?" Stella let out a laugh. She also lacked the art of small talk, which is why they got along so well. "And this is why you're my favorite." Out of context, most people would have been taken aback by the wildly random question. But much like Stella, Violet had only one thing on the brain: penguins. "Monitoring the test outputs, we've exceeded 97.8% accuracy, but the specification was to connect penguins with unique names. I'm not feeling empathy for Gale.2, and Gale.3 is redundant," Violet rattled on. Violet was a coder and user experience expert. She had studied for years on ways to connect humans and computers, and if anyone understood the importance of giving each of these creatures a name, it was her. "I was leaning toward a large language model to supply the unlimited number of naming options, rather than creating a database," Stella said, looking out the window, her mind wandering back to her morning walk. It could solve two problems. It would be able to generate an unlimited number of names, and it would provide a natural language interface to learn about each of the penguins when connected to our backend. The algorithm she had painstakingly coded was clever, yes, but it was just matching penguins to names from her well-worn Hunger Games books. Gale, Katniss, Peeta. But there were only so many names a database could generate before it just added numbers to the end and to keep them distinct. The algorithm she had painstakingly coded was clever, yes, but it was just matching penguins to names from her well-worn Hunger Games books. Gale, Katniss, Peeta. But there were only so many names a database could generate before it just added numbers to the end to keep them distinct. The depersonalization of the penguins was the kiss of death. That's where the large language models, LLMs, could come in. Stella considered their power at the edge of possibility. LLMs weren't built to regurgitate data. They were trained on vast oceans of text. Entire libraries of human thought, language, and creativity. They didn't simply follow patterns, they could bend them, reshape them, and create something startling and new. Trained on billions of data points, they could weave words in a way that made each one feel fresh. For Stella's penguins, it meant limitless identities, not bound by any preset list of names. Each bird could have a name as unique as the snowflakes beneath its flippers, an identity drawn from the endless well of human language. And the beauty wasn't just in the names. The LLMs could talk, not in the clunky, robotic way of the early systems, but in the fluid, almost conversational manner that made you forget you were speaking to a machine at all. Stella imagined it. Scientists asking, "What's the migration pattern of Peeta?" and getting an answer as natural as if they were asking her. Or, "How many penguins did we detect last week?" and watching as the model sifted through the back end, pulling data as if it were flipping through a book. No need for complex commands or technical knowledge. Just ask the question and the LLM could do the rest. What made it all so irresistible was the adaptability. LLMs weren't static. They learned, evolved, and shaped themselves to the needs of the moment. As Stella's penguin database expanded, the LLM would keep pace, generating new names without falling into repetition. As users asked more questions, the system would dig deeper, offering insights into behavior, patterns, and anomalies with a simple, intuitive interface. It wasn't just about naming penguins anymore. It was about creating a living, breathing system, a tool that could evolve right alongside the world it was observing. That was the real magic. But the accuracy of the LLMs, even well-controlled ones, is only between 70 and 90%. This meant that you had to account for up to 30% of the information you got back being wrong or made up. This is called a hallucination. Hallucinations had bitten many of the early adopters. There was the Canadian airline fiasco. They had used an open-source LLM to replace their customer service representatives with an AI chatbot. But they failed to put the right guards in place, and the chatbot erroneously created a bereavement policy, basically lying to a grieving passenger and making the company liable for the promised full airfare refund. Let's use OpenLlama. We can use it offline. It will work when it is on the server and even when there is no internet connection, Violet suggested. We wanted to open source the Penguin algorithm anyway, so the licensing works, Stella agreed. What's the risk profile? The risk is low for both LLM and open source, Violet responded. We were just naming penguins. The worst thing that could happen is they had bad naming, duplicates, or maybe offensive words included. Stella made a note to herself to update the LLM prompt to not use offensive words. The risk is high, though, Violet continued. If image data is stored and includes people's faces, that would be a privacy violation. Stella nodded, her mind drifting back to her previous work with Violet. They frequently ran through risk analysis exercises, and in any typical scenario involving the collection and storage of human images, privacy concerns would be front and center. Just a few months ago, one of her software vendors had recorded a routine meeting. At the time, Stella hadn't given it a second thought. Meetings were often recorded. But a week later, she sat in stunned silence as that same vendor presenting at a conference pulled her video up on the big screen to showcase their new AI feature. She had felt utterly exposed. Yes, technically, the company had the right to use the video since she had agreed to be recorded for the meeting. But repurposing that video without her permission had blindsided her. It wasn't a legal line crossed. It was a matter of respect. She would never release software that risked capturing people's faces without careful planning and full consent. But this was Antarctica, she reminded herself. There would be no humans in these images, just vast landscapes and a colony of penguins. For once, the risks seemed refreshingly distant. She was comfortable contributing penguin naming to the open source community. Open source software was a beautiful yet messy beast. A lot like that sourdough starter she kept in her fridge, the one she had barely had time to feed but couldn't quite bring herself to throw out. Open source worked the same way. Someone, somewhere, had created the original starter. They'd fed it, nurtured it, carefully mixed the right ingredients of code until it was alive, capable of transforming into something meaningful. And then, like any good baker, they split it off and sent pieces of it out into the world for others to use. But here's the thing about sourdough and open source. Once it's out there, you have no control over what happens next. One person might care for it just as you did, feeding it regularly and using it to bake perfect golden brown loaves. Another might forget about it for a few days, toss in a bit of this or that, and suddenly it's taken on an entirely different character. And when that person passes it along to someone else, who knows what they'll use it for? You might have set out to bake a simple loaf or bread, but down the line, someone's fermenting that starter into beer. Community sharing, passing code around, improving it, and experimenting is the heartbeat of open source. Just as the flavors in your bread change subtly depending on where your starter's been and who's handled it, software evolves as more and more developers contribute to it. Sometimes the transformations are radical, and you end up with something completely different from what you intended. The software you built for writing novels could be adapted by someone else to catfish the elderly and steal their life savings. Stella ended the call with her marching orders in hand. They would copy the open source LLM and bring it into their program. With this, unlimited penguin names would appear in the database in mere hours. Working with Violet was a gift. Stella loved that kid. Well, adult, but at her age, anyone in their 20s was young enough to be her kid. Stella tapped her fingers on the desk, staring as the database updates flickered across her screen. There would be a slight delay in processing time to obtain the unique names, but it was worth it. After it finished updating, Stella started a video call to Violet. "Are you ready to push this out into the wild?" Stella leaned back in her chair. She eyed Violet, who was furiously typing away, clearly in her zone. "I'm halfway through the process now," Violet said without looking up. "We're still calling it the Penguin Games, right?" Stella snarfed in her tea. "Obviously." Violet smirked. She shared her screen, the familiar lines of code visible to Stella. "I've added the README. Nothing fancy, just the basics so the nerds know what to do. Also added the common license, so anybody who uses this has to credit LAT and must contribute their work back to the open source. You want to do the honors, or shall I?" Stella nodded. These were the terms of the engagement with National Geographic, and it had to be the terms with what she released. "You do it." Stella picked up her tea and sipped. "I'll just watch and feel proud." "Sure thing." Violet's fingers flew across the keyboard. "Okay, pushing it to the world. Now." She leaned back and stretched. "And there we go. It's officially out there. The Penguin Games is live. May the odds be ever in their favor." Stella raised her mug in a remote cheers. "I give it a week before someone turns it into a pigeon tracker," Violet answered. Stella shrugged. "Maybe someone will use it to name geese. Either way, it's done. It's officially part of the open source world." Violet shook her head. "Yep. Now let's sit back and watch the chaos unfold." Stella knew Violet was not happy about the terms of the engagement. As National Geographic was a publicly funded program, the work completed on the project had to be contributed to open source. They had both seen what the nerds did to open source. They took it, modified the work, and used it for their most perverse whims. But Stella had agreed to the terms. Penguins were not people, and Violet was along for the ride despite her reservations. Stella whistled for Finnick, hooked him up, and headed out for their afternoon walk in the fields.